I'm going to start with a question at St. Constantine, especially in the junior high, high school, and college. I mostly teach in college, but also hang out with high schoolers too. We always start with a question at the beginning of class. So here is my question. It's not, well, from me. It's from the poet and critic Geoffrey Hill. This is from a lecture called "How Ill White Hairs Become a Fool and Jester." That's just a quotation from Shakespeare. Really, the topic of this lecture that I'm quoting from is on poetry and perjury, and you'll see those terms come up in the question. Do poets approach language as a neutral instrument for confessional themes, on occasion themes of perjury, or do they, in the very act of writing them, or writing poetry, manifestly reveal language itself, particularly language twisted into poetic shapes, as a substance of imagination radically perjured? The New York Times bestseller list for fiction is an instructive place. Not, as you might guess, for literary quality, but it shows us, it instructs us even, in what kind of books American readers do in fact buy, not read. It would take a whole other study to see if those Dan Brown books that people buy every time they come out. The hardback of Origin is out right now. Has anyone bought the new Dan Brown book? No one that will admit it here. Oh, good. Who is Dan Brown? He wrote the Da Vinci Code. He's currently at the top. Well, I actually haven't checked today. A couple days ago, he was at the top of the fiction bestseller list. Certain of our well-regarded poets sometimes make it onto this fiction bestseller list. Billy Collins, Mary Oliver, you may have heard of them. But for the most part, the fiction list is dominated by novel writers. Until 2015. That is. Because in 2015, an Indian-Canadian poet named Rupi Kaur, or Kaur, I'm going to mispronounce this word, I think it's something more like Kaur, published the book Milk and Honey, which has become not only one of the best-selling poetry books of the millennium, not difficult given that poetry doesn't really sell well, but one of the best-selling books, period. Here are some numbers. This volume of poetry sold 1 million copies in its first year of publication in the US, was on the New York Times bestseller list for 52 consecutive weeks, at time outselling all novels, even very popular novels by Stephen King, Dan Brown, etc. Kaur's new collection, Sun and Flowers, which if you go to Walmart and look at the book stand, you can buy, just came out 2 weeks ago, and it is currently vying for the top spot with Dan Brown. That's why I said I'm not sure whether Brown is on top right now, because Kaur might actually be outselling him. Milk and Honey has been published in over 25 languages, so it's not just North American readers who like her poetry. When people the world over think of poetry written in English today, they think of Rupi Kaur. She is the most prevalent exporter of poetry in North America. I'm going to quote for you, and you have actually written there, my favorite Kaur poem from Milk and Honey. It goes like this. I know I should crumble for better reasons, but have you seen that boy? He brings the sun to its knees every night. What I like about this poem, try real hard to say that I like something about it, is the surprise in it. And I really do mean this. Something too often missing in Kaur's poetry is surprise, but I think there's surprise here. The first few lines are the typical unmetered, barely crafted colloquialisms of contemporary free verse. I know I, but have you seen? But then the poem, in the last 2 lines, well, really 3 lines, turns to fantasy. I won't say fairy tale. Not just the speaker, but the sun itself falls down before this boy. It's the kind of conceit we might find in the metaphysical poets of the 17th century, though bereft of their formal craft and lofted wit. Here is John Donne addressing the sun in the aptly titled The Sun Rising. Thy beams so reverend and strong, why shouldst thou think I could eclipse and cloud them with a wink? done. He's good, what can we say? But she's writing in that vein. She's taking up that metaphysical, poetic image that the beloved is someone who has an effect not just on the lover, but on the universe itself. It's the kind of wording and way of saying it that we might like in a pop song. We might hope that song comes on the radio so we can hear that cool turn of phrase again. Sadly, most of Kaur's conceits are not so surprising and memorable. Here's one of the more regrettable poems in the collection. I didn't quote this because you can just memorize it hearing me say it. This is the whole poem. You are your own soulmate. Such cliched language is frustrating, and also, basically, it's metaphysically nonsensical. There's only one person involved in this conversation, the you. How can you be a soulmate with, it doesn't make sense. Such cliched language is frustrating because Kaur's subjects are often important ones, especially when she writes about the trauma that can come from unhealthy familial and romantic relationships. You were so afraid of my voice, I decided to be afraid of it too, she says to someone who has hurt her. Such a description seems born out of the language of therapeutic examination of past experience. And many have praised Kaur for giving voice to the wounds that so many experience in our very wounded age. Kaur herself writes in her foreword to Milk and Honey that her poetry comes from thinking about how her experience with abuse and healing mirrors the experience of so many other women. Quote, in exploring my own womanhood, I think of the pains that have afflicted those around me, what it was that made these women into milk and honey, that smooth, that thick. In particular, Kaur speaks of her own family, who she says lived through the 1984 genocide of Sikhs in India. The women who lived through it, she writes, their resilience is breathtaking. And if you read that forward, which is a little difficult to read, she does go into some of the details of the hardships during genocide. One could be forgiven for wishing that the historical particularity of her prose foreword were retained in any of her poems. Instead of women grounded in time, place, and culture in her poems, we have only the ubiquitous you and I as the subjects of every poem. Again, this is the diction of the pop song. But before that, it's the diction of the lyric poem. For as much as Kaur pleads in her poem To All Young Poets, and this next one I quote, you must never trade honesty for relatability. But Kaur has chosen to write her poems in a supremely relatable language, the language of the lyric. And also, honesty and relatability we kind of equate today. I'm not really sure what she's talking about, honesty and relatability. I'm gonna actually warn right here, don't go read Milk and Honey. It's very PG-13 and sometimes R-rated in its discussion of romantic relationships and trauma, but it's all done in a very, very boring way. And I think that's what's so frustrating about it. That level of you are your own soulmate, she uses to talk about real pain. And, well, I'll have more to say about that. I don't want to totally dismiss Kaur. I actually have some recommendations for her. The lyric poem, as we know it, was invented at the beginning of history on the Greek islands of the Eastern Aegean in the 7th century BC, around the same time as the biblical poet, or biblical king, Josiah. Supreme among lyric poetry's inventors was the poet Sappho. Praised by no less than Plato as the 10th muse, Sappho was a master of the love poem. Sadly, we only possess fragments of her alleged 9 books of poems, but what we have is indelible, and this is the next poem. Seems to me that he is a godlike being. What's his name? The mortal across from you there. How he tunes himself to your speech like sugar. How he is drinking every giggle, brimming his love. And I can plainly feel my heart in its ribcage shudder. Only takes my glimpsing of you, and then my voice is accosted. Cannot move my idiot tongue, and tiny flames, it seems, are teeming within my hot skin. Eyes can only focus on you, and ears are deaf with a drumming. Bring on cold sweat, quivering, queasy, seized all over, blanch me down to a sickly green hue. Death is barely worse than this horrid feeling, let me assure you. This poem, fragment 31, is spoken in the voice of the lover, who beholds their beloved with another man. So common is this trope in love poems and songs. Just turn on the radio, right? Every other song is like, baby, I love you, but you love him instead. So common is this trope in love poems and songs that we forget it had to be invented, and that Sappho invented it. Though there is likely at least 3 other lines in the original, the Greek text we have cuts off mid-stanza. Those stanzas that we have are a masterful balance of agony. The first stanza begins with a meditation on the man who is close to the beloved, or you. He is godlike to the speaker. He is attentive to every word and laugh of the beloved. You could learn a thing or two from him. The speaker, on the other hand, is unable to tend. Their voice won't work, their skin burns, their ears are muffled with the beating of their heart, they feel feverish, and finally, in contrast with the godlikeness of the mortal who sits near the beloved, the speaker seems close to death itself. Both the ancients and those who came after them considered this very poem a crash course in how to express the physical sensations that accompany unrequited romantic love. And these sensations, the teeming flames, the queasy fever, stand out to all first-time readers. In fact, Kaur's use of the word crumble in relation to the boy she likes is indebted to Sappho's descriptions. Less apparent on the outset, perhaps, is the formal perfection of Sappho's stanzas. Every stanza contains 4 lines, the first 3 of which are written in what we would call, now get ready for a poetry term, trochaic pentameter with a dactylic substitution in the 3rd foot. Did everybody follow that? In Greek, the rhythm would be something like this. Long, short, long, short, long, short, short, long, short, long, short. Or in English, and I tried to get this in my reading a little bit, you can try it out loud and see if it works. It's something like bada 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 da bada 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 da bada bada. You can try it out. Now, this 4th line, though, is a dactylic foot and a trochaic foot, just a single dactyl and single trochee. Long, short, short, long, short, or da-da-da-da-da. So the rhythm of the whole stanza in every Sapphic poem is da-da-da-da-da-da-da-da-da-da, da-da-da-da-da-da-da-da-da-da, da-da-da-da-da-da-da-da-da-da. Sappho invented this poetic form, and ever since it has been called the Sapphic stanza. Most of her other most famous poems are written in it, including fragment 16, where Sappho muses on the place of romantic love in the context of the whole of human experience. And I know one person in this room is writing a term paper on this poem. Maybe it's an army on horse or marching. Maybe it's a navy with white sails that's most beautiful of things on the black earth. I say, it's who you love most. Look, it's very easy to prove this point to all. For think of Helen the Wayward, greatest mortal beauty, blessed with a handsome husband, noble and honored. Still she sailed for love to the Trojan homeland. What of children? What of her dearest parents? She forgot them, left them behind. I miss you, Anactoria. Honestly, I'd rather I heard your lovely steps, or saw your radiant face again, than watched an Eastern chariot race, or one more tiresome phalanx. You guys know what a phalanx is? What's a phalanx? Oh, a phalanx is, you know what a phalanx is. The shield structure that the Greeks would use. They would basically create like a turtle shell of shields. Apparently, it was masterful. They won so many battles. Sappho's having none of that. Regrettably, we are missing a stanza or two in between. I tried to pause there, and you can see that little dot, dot, dot. And the stanzas that we're missing, I would love to know what they say. they're in between this description of Helen and then the more personal reflection on Anactoria, this friend or beloved that is missing. But the comparison between Helen and Anactoria is clear enough. Just as Helen shuns all other relationships with her children, her parents, even her husband, because of her greatest love, Paris, so the speaker counts all other marvels as nothing compared to their lover or beloved, Anactoria. The marvels that are rejected are telling as well. An army on horse or marching or on ships are among the most marvelous things described by the epic poet, Homer, Sappho's strongest poetic predecessor. Here is Homer describing such an army. I'm going to cut this down a little bit for time's sake. As when a glittering fire rages through an immense forest on the mountain height, and from afar the flare shows forth, so the gleam from the sublime bronze of marching men, glinting through the sky, reached heaven. Ah, marching men. No. All this glory Sappho rejects in preference of the beloved. This should not, moreover, be confused with a Platonic desire for the beautiful itself in some ideal realm. Rather, it is the individual beloved of each individual lover. The man who sits and pines after Anactoria, he's got his sights focused on what's really important in life, she says. Okay. This is the realm of the lyric, then. The lover musing about the beloved, and at their most lofty, speculating that the beloved is the best, most beautiful sight on the earth. This focus on the ultimate questions suggests that the lyric speaker's allegiance is to the cult of Aphrodite in the ancient world, the goddess of love, rather than the cult of Mars, god of war, or even Hera, goddess of marriage. It's a very important distinction. It's not marriage love that's being celebrated. It's the teenage guy having a crush on the teenage girl and wanting to do anything for her, even really stupid things. As we know from Greek myth, the rejection of Hera in preference for Aphrodite is supremely dangerous. It brings about, well, the fall of Troy. Sappho doubles down on her allegiance to Aphrodite in poem number 1. She says, Aphrodite on your immortal bright throne, please, wise-minded daughter of Zeus, I beg you, do not sear my sorrowing heart with more hurt, guide of my spirit. In the final line of this stanza, it's not on your list, sorry, Sappho calls Aphrodite potnia in Greek. I've translated it guide, but it could also mean like lady or mistress or lord. Lord of my heart, Aphrodite. The speaker is ruled by Aphrodite, and over the course of the poem, we see that Aphrodite lends her divine aid to the speaker, softening the unwilling heart of the beloved. Thus, the lyric at its outset has a double concern, the beloved and the divine. But the divine is a way to achieve the beloved, not the other way around. For the greatest thing on earth is not the goddess of love, but the one who the love goddess turns you toward. At this point, we might think, Greek lyric is dangerous. It celebrates a love that can make one antagonistic to community, to family, even to personal health. I have a fever. I feel horrible because I got a crush on this girl, but she doesn't like me. She likes another guy. The lovers in both poem 1 and fragments 16 and 31 are in emotional and physical agony. Death is hardly worse, they say. Still, there is the hope that the lover might achieve a type of deification. Sappho uses the Greek word theoisin when she says equal to gods, or the godlike man, or godlike being. If in the good graces of the beloved, perhaps one could become godlike. But the lyric lovers in Sappho's poems, all these hapless, pining teenage boys, are on the outside looking in. Out of favor of the beloved, they follow Aphrodite into sickness and even death, which in Helen's case is the death of her beloved's whole society. The formal elements cannot be ignored either. All of the danger, anxiety, and thrill of romantic love in the lyric are held within the bounds of a strict form, a regular and exacting meter. Da, 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 da. One might even say that the raw power of romantic love in ancient Greece necessitated such boundaries. Aristotle agrees. He says in his Poetics, and this is the next quote, that such formal constraints are natural to humans. It's one of my favorite passages in all of ancient philosophy. Poetry in general seems to have sprung from two causes, each of them lying deep in our nature. First, the instinct of imitation is implanted in man from childhood. One difference between him and other animals being that he is the most imitative of living creatures, and through imitation learns his earliest lessons, and no less universal is the pleasure felt in things imitated. Imitation, then, is one instinct in our nature. Next, there is the instinct for harmony and rhythm, meters being manifestly sections of rhythm. Persons, therefore, starting with this natural gift, developed by degrees their special aptitudes, till their rude improvisations gave birth to poetry. I love that. Their rude improvisations in meter and imitation gave birth to poetry. The story of what happened to Sappho's poetry after antiquity has been told many times. Her 9 books of poems were at the Library of Alexandria. We all know that that didn't last. And we only know the poems we do because many ancient writers whose works survived quoted her, often in high praise of her. They say, hey, have you read book 3 of those poems of Sappho? Oh, those are so good. Here's a line. That line is all we have of book 3 now. Oh, it's difficult. Curiously, if that depressed you, curiously, new poems by Sappho keep being discovered. In 2004 and again in 2014, nearly complete poems by Sappho were found on obscure fragments of papyrus. These were greeted with surprise and joy by Sappho scholars, but emerged into a century, ours, that has largely moved on from the formal concerns of Sappho and all of her praisers after her. When we speak of 21st century poetry, we have to temper our formal expectations. To discover any sort of metrical regularity in a contemporary poem is a welcome treat, and there are enough contemporary poets writing in traditional verse forms that one does not lose all hope of such a discovery. I blogged about this a couple weeks ago. I sort of gave a list, Geoffrey Hill, Marilyn Nelson, Don Patterson, Dana Gioia, just a few, A.E. Stallings. We only ask for a little pentameter here, a little rhymed couplet there, and we are satisfied that prosody, that is the study of formal meter, is not totally dead yet. Of course, the most ancient forms of verse, dactylic hexameter of Homer and the Sapphic stanza, have long since been abandoned by even the most formally conservative of poets for the verse forms of the Renaissance masters and the Romantics. Here are couplets, blank verse, the ballad, and with this, I guess we just have to be content. Here's a problem, though. The major translations of Sappho's newly discovered poems have not been in Sapphic stanzas, but all in free verse. For that is what the poetry reading public expects, even of translations of ancient texts that were highly formally structured in the original languages. One of the maddening aspects of developing curriculum in a great book school like St. Constantine, which is mostly such a joy, but this is one of the maddening aspects. There's a dearth of formal translations of ancient and medieval poetry. Every translator and their mother has taken a swing at the Iliad. You should go to Barnes & Noble. There's like 12 different translations of the Iliad from like the last couple decades, not even centuries, decades. But there is, to my knowledge, only one English translation in dactylic hexameter in print. If we look at Sappho, the situation's even worse. At least 4 major translations of Sappho have been published in the last 2 decades. I have a stack of them on my desk. But none have actually used the Sapphic stanza form for any of the translations. All are in free verse. Diane J. Rayer, the most recent translator of Sappho for Cambridge University Press, explains, "To recreate the vivid and direct effects of the Greek, I retain all specific details and imagery, while compensating for formal aspects, such as lyric meters, that sound awkward in English." When, in 2014, a translator of classical poetry for Cambridge University Press suggests that lyric meters sound awkward in English, it should not surprise us that the best-selling poetry of 2015, 2016, and it looks like 2017 is going to be Rupi Kaur. Let me ask, have we decided that Aristotle was wrong about human nature in regards to poetry? Namely, have we decided that the instinct for harmony and rhythm, that is for formal meter, is not in fact one that gives birth to poetry anymore? At least I assume Kaur would be in agreement with Aristotle that poetry should seek to imitate human life or emotions. Otherwise, she would not write in To All You Young Poets that they should seek honesty above all. But sir, you may be saying, are you forgetting your beloved Foreword to Milk and Honey, which you just praised as better than all the poems in it? I blink, and I'm not sure what you're talking about. So you point me, so say this is you and this is me, you take Milk and Honey and you point me to page 16. Oh, page 16, how did I forget? Kaur writes, when I begin writing poetry, it's all in the present tense, very in vogue, the present tense. I blame Suzanne Collins. When I begin writing poetry in high school, I have a deep desire to write in my mother tongue. There is a beauty in its design. Gurmukhi, a script in which Punjabi is written, uses only the period. There is no other punctuation. All letters are treated the same. No distinction between upper and lower case. I enjoy the simplicity, how symmetrical and absolutely straightforward. For a while, I try to write poetry in Punjabi, but I fail because I cannot utilize the language viscerally enough. I wonder to myself what might happen if I include some of its characteristics in my English work. Just periods, all lowercase. That is how the design of Milk and Honey is born. And as you can see on the poems I quoted, it's all lowercase, only periods. Well, thank you for that, imagined counter-arguer. I respond that this impulse to simplify punctuation and capitalization on Kaur's part is interesting. She explains that she attempts to lend her English verse some of the symmetrical and absolutely straightforward qualities of Gurmukhi script. If you look up Gurmukhi script, it's beautiful. The Sikh scriptures are written in Gurmukhi. Very beautiful. If there is a formal dimension to Kaur's work, it is this visual effect of the words and punctuation that imitates the visual effect of the Punjabi script. But a disciplined study of Sappho might lead one to suggest that the symmetry and visceralness that Kaur desires, I strongly agree with her that poetry should be visceral. The symmetry and visceralness that Kaur desires would be greatly enhanced by attending to metrical form. Sadly, the Cambridge University translator reminds us, lyric meters sound awkward in English, especially those of Sappho. Can't have awkwardness. But do they? And we're done. No. Let me suggest in the last couple minutes that they don't. If one thought so, one might be surprised to open the September 2010 issue of Poetry Magazine, the premier poetry magazine of both America and Britain, arguably, to find several poems in it by the British poet Geoffrey Hill that have this meter. Da 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 da. Da 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 da. Da 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 da. Da 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 da. That same year, if one was to open up a recently released book by the American poet Marilyn Hacker titled Names, and one flipped to the back, one would find a long poem in 13 stanzas, every stanza metered da 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 da. Okay, I won't go all through it. It seems that living poets have dared where Cambridge translators fear to tread. Let's look first at Hacker's poem in sapphic stanzas in 2010, titled A Braid of Garlic. We don't have time to look at all 13 stanzas, but let's look at the last two. Well, it's actually stanza, the third to last and last stanza. These are in commemoration of the Palestinian poet Mahmoud Darwish, who died in 2008, and they're a commemoration of him. At the end of elegant proofs in lyric, incoherent, furious trolls in diapers, fragile and ephemeral as all beauty, the human spirit. Thousands mourn him while in the hush and hum of life support for multiple organ failure. Utter solitude, poise of scarlet wings that flutter and vanish. Hacker juxtaposes the esteem and genius of Darwish, his elegant proofs and lyrics, with the realities of geriatric care in a hospital. Diapers, life support machines, the incoherence and fury of the failing body. For Hacker, the human spirit is fragile and ephemeral as all beauty. The important word here is all. This is what beauty is, she seemed to say, on the black earth. Fragile, ephemeral, but worth preserving in poetry, not just in any honest expression, but in an ancient form. Is it fanciful to think that our placing of grief and our honor in the face of death into a poetic form almost 3 millennia old will somehow make that poem itself more immune to death? She honors a master of lyric poetry, Darwish, in the best way a poet could, by writing of him in the original lyric stanza, Sappho's. The Sapphic stanzas that Geoffrey Hill published in Poetry Magazine in 2010 was collected with others into a volume that Hill titled Odi Barbare, published in 2012. There are 52 Sapphic poems in the collection. I need to do some research. This might be the largest body of Sapphic stanzas in the English language. It rivals all of Sappho's known work just in line count. Sappho's lyric stanzas sound awkward in English. I'm sorry. Someone needs to call up Rayer and tell her I'm making light of her. She's a great translator. She's a better translator than I. She knows Greek better. But why isn't, I don't know. Like Hacker, Hill has made a name for himself in the late 20th century as a poet in the English formal tradition. And like Hacker, his 21st century turn to Sapphics proves, I would argue, instructively successful. Now here's the next poem translated. This poem, 28, though of course it's in Roman numerals because this is Geoffrey Hill. He has to make everything a little difficult. In this, he provides a full-fledged meditation on love, that central theme of lyric. Real quick, Mrs. Muller suggested that this would be about Christian poetry. We're finally getting to the Christian poetry. Broken that first kiss by the race to shelter, scratchy brisk rain irritable as tinder, hearing light thrum faintly the chords of laurel, taller than we were. Fear to have already the direst choosing, 60 years spent as by procrastination. Answer one question, this is all I need, so speeding denial. Ancient question haunting the Platonist, can spirit ransom body, and if so, could I rise again in presence of your devoting sorrow to sorrow? Quick, is love's truth seriously immortal? Would you might think so and not be this other, finally known only through affirmation's failing induction? What though wedded, we would have had annulment's consummation early, and though in darkness I could see that glimmerous rim of folly lave our condition, had we not so stumbled on grace betimely, in that chance day brief as the sun's arising, preternaturally without a shadow, cast in its presence. Like most Hill poems, this is a complex object. Its syntax is by turns clipped and labyrinthine, its exact meanings and reference often elusive. To use Rupi Kaur's terms, it seems not at all relatable, but neither can we tell at first glance if it is honest. We must sit with it, unlike Kaur's poems, which are a hit on Instagram for a reason. After spending many recent days with this poem, I would read it before I went to bed every night, and it would flit in and out through my dreams. I think it reveals itself to be a meditation on a missed opportunity at romance, among other things. The first kiss is interrupted by rain, and this prompts two philosophical questions. Can spirit ransom body? And is love's truth immortal? These questions are in the same family as that which Sappho implies in fragment 16. What is the loveliest thing on the black earth? But Hill, being in the Platonic Christian humanist tradition that he is, looks further into eternity than Sappho. Once the body is gone, what remains of the love the spirit experienced while in the body? Does love last past death into eternity? Here again are the two great lyric concerns, the beloved and the divine, but Hill reverses them in his estimation from how Sappho has them. It is the divine that lasts, the divine that the spirit will experience past death, and it is the task of the mortal lover to consider what, if any, of their love for the beloved will last. Hill presses on the relationship between love and the divine even further in the final stanza. The missing of the first kiss between the lovers due to rain, he calls their stumbling on grace betimely. Whereas in Sappho, the goddess of love leads lovers inexorably toward their beloved, in Hill, the grace of the divine rescues would-be lovers from a kiss that is, for some reason, unfitting. The question I immediately ask after reading and marveling at Sappho's and Hacker's and Hill's poems is this: could the considerable audience that lauds and buys Kaur's work possibly do the same for Sappho and Hacker and Hill? We've already seen that Sappho has been popular enough in this century to warrant new translations every few years. But we've also seen that these translations have begun to slide in their eschewal of form toward the very unmetered formlessness of Kaur's work. Hacker and Hill are well regarded in poetry circles, but wholly unknown in the global pop social media circles in which Kaur shines. I'm tempted to say that the reason Kaur shines is that she has reached those who are otherwise unreached by poetry, and has whetted their appetite for verse, by often talking about topics that are very, very important to us. I mean, who hasn't felt like they've been unjustly silenced by someone? And in reading that poem about silencing their voice and then learning to believe that they should be silent, who hasn't felt that? Maybe mildly, maybe very acutely. In her insistence on poetry as primarily straightforward, honest speech, however, Kaur has taken a side on that old debate that we considered in our opening question. Do poets approach language? You knew I was going to get back to it. We'll end with it. Do poets approach language as the neutral instrument for confessional themes, or do they, in the very act of writing them, manifestly reveal language itself, particularly language twisted into poetic shapes, as a substance of imagination? Perhaps a substance of imagination, perjured, maybe as an honest subject of imagination. Ever since Sylvia Plath or Maya Angelou in the 60s, both came out popularly in the 60s with confessional works, poetry in the popular imagination has been assumed to be, in fact, the first, a neutral vehicle for confession. But at least Plath, and certainly Hacker and Hill, would take issue with this. They all understood that the deep artifice of poetry, that poetry at its most robust always contains language twisted into shapes, but that verse nevertheless can tackle confessional themes, but never simply. There is always the dangerous precipice of perjury. Poets invent, says Hill later in the lecture. Poets invent even their confessions. Far from denying the truth of a poet's reported experience, something we care very deeply about today, Hill means here that a poem is in its essence an invented thing. An invention in its fullness always necessitates formal decisions and formal craft. As I tell my writing students, every sentence, every phrase, every choice of word you make is a creative, formal act. And the more you are aware of this in your writing, the more careful and more successful your writing will be. In her meditation on Gurmukhi script, Kaur proves that she can and does think at the level of formal invention and imitation. What Sappho, Hacker, and Hill demonstrate, both in a pagan and in a Christian context, is the application of this level of thought to harmonic and rhythmic structure. And this level of thought is, I argue, necessary in all great lyric poetry. To lose it would be effectively to lose lyric itself.